But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In today's episode, we're going to look at the words of the young art critic Albert Aurier, who wrote the one and only review, basically a 5-star review for Vincent van Gogh, and it was written in the month of January 1890. So a little bit more than 130 years ago, and around about 2 to 3 weeks. That is when this review was written. And as you can imagine, Vincent van Gogh was very excited about it. He refers to it quite often. Following this episode, I'm going to be putting up another letter where he talks about, I think on the 19th, he writes to his mother, and he talks about this review. Before I get to that, I want to address something someone commented on the previous video, and this is something that is likely to come up again and again and again. The mainstream view of Vincent van Gogh is that he was mad and that he suffered from a mental disorder. So that is the view of the Vincent van Gogh Museum. That is the view of many scholars. That's been the view of Vincent van Gogh, I would say, probably for the last 120 years. It's probably only in the last 10 years that people have started actually thinking about it. And if you go to Naifa and Smith, they've got their version. Bernadette Murphy's also got her version. But if you want to say, I don't believe that, I think it's obvious that Vincent van Gogh has mental illness, well, then you're in the majority. You know, then you can sort of say, you know, I'm with the Van Gogh Museum. The Van Gogh Museum, why would they not know? So, you know, then that's great. Then you don't need to watch any of these videos, because these videos will be providing a different narrative and a totally different story. And it's going to be challenging that. And this is really for people open-minded, curious, interested in facts and research and information, and in finding out the true identity of who a person is. If you're not interested in that, and also if you think True Crime Rocket Science isn't credible, isn't authentic, isn't intelligent, doesn't know what it's talking about, you should steer clear of this channel, because you're just going to make yourself miserable. It's the same as if you believe Chris Watts is a narcissist and that explains everything. Then you have no business, you know, it's just absolutely pointless listening to True Crime Rocket Science, because that's not scientific. That is what a talk show host said and one or two experts. It's not an insight into criminal psychology. And in the same way, calling Vincent van Gogh mad isn't telling you anything about the artist, isn't telling you anything about who he was and the dynamics going on with him or anything like that. As I say, the majority share your view. So if you're worried that True Crime Rocket Science is going to upset the apple cart, and it is, but if you just disagree with it, then just stay away from this channel, just ignore it. Unsubscribe, don't pay any attention to these videos, because I can tell you now, the case that's being made between now and the end of July is that Vincent van Gogh wasn't mentally ill, and that he didn't commit suicide because he's mentally ill. He didn't commit suicide, he wasn't mentally ill. But if you want to hold on to that, if you sort of feel like, I like the idea of a mentally ill Van Gogh, you should avoid this channel. Also, if you're going to come every day and sort of repeat the same thing, no, I think Vincent van Gogh's mentally ill, it's not going to work. I'm trying to build a case, and if you sort of adamant that you think it's not the case, and again, the mainstream shares your view, the Van Gogh Museum shares your view. So, well done, you've scored your point, but then you don't need to hang around to keep scoring the point. This is for people who are open-minded and want to know something that they didn't know. This is for people who want to think about Vincent van Gogh in new ways, and not Vincent van Gogh from what I say, not Vincent van Gogh from what the experts say, not Vincent van Gogh from what the Van Gogh Museum says, not Vincent van Gogh from what a book says, Vincent van Gogh from what he says and what the art critics at the time, as we're going to deal with today, said. I'm just going to take it a little bit further. I do anticipate a kind of a pushback in this, just because he's famous for being mentally ill. In fact, he's the poster child for the sort of troubled, mentally ill artist who's nevertheless a creative genius. So I do expect pushback. But in the same way with the Watts case, if you're going to do the thing where you say the shadows on the driveway are little children running around, or that it's Nicole Kessinger, then I'm just not going to allow that kind of stuff on this channel. I'm trying to make a particular case. If you're not interested in that and you want to insist on the conspiracies, the uninformed conspiracies, which are the most popular, it's the popular conspiracy that I'm challenging, you're not going to be happy at this site. Now, the converse to all of that is when we tackle the mental illness issue, and we will, you start to see how much disagreement there is on it. And something that I didn't mention earlier was that, you know, how Vincent van Gogh was treated at the asylum. He was treated, number one, with digitalis, which is poisonous, and number two, with hot and cold baths. That was kind of how they were trying to treat whatever he had. Now, if someone is truly mad, you think hot and cold baths is going to do anything about that? If you've got bipolar disorder, you think hot and cold baths is going to help you? If you've got schizophrenia, do you think it's going to help you? No, it's not. So something else that I want to just draw your attention to before we get into Albert Aurier, and I'm a little bit upset by this just because it's such an irritating, it's like the obvious thing that everyone thinks about, but they can't get past it. They can't like put that aside and say, okay, let's consider that maybe he wasn't mentally ill. No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to think about him as not being mentally ill. And there's a discussion to have about that. You know, why do people not like the idea of a mentally healthy Vincent van Gogh? I think because they like to identify with him. They like to feel a shared sense of misery and a shared sense of victimhood. That's what I think that the reason is. Because if there isn't a mental disorder with Vincent van Gogh, then who is responsible for what happened to him? If you go to Lust for Life, and also not just Lust for Life, but the history around Vincent van Gogh, when he went to, and I'm jumping ahead of the game here, but I just want to address this, and I think by the 10-minute mark I will hopefully be done with it. But basically, when he went to Auvers-sur-Oise, this is north of Paris, when he left the asylum, he went into the custody and care of a doctor who specialized in depression and mental illness, and that was Dr. Gachet. We're going to talk a lot about Dr. Gachet. I first want you to try and get to know these people. And this is why it agitates me that someone is jumping the gun already, sort of saying, yes, I know you don't think he was mentally ill, but I really believe he was mentally ill. He really, really was mentally ill. I'm convinced of it. If you can't get beyond that, then there's no point in following any of this. Then you should just take a bit of a hiatus from True Crime Rocket Science. Just sort of, I don't know, do something else. Because One thing Dr. Gachet said to Vincent van Gogh, and it's historical, we know this for a fact, is he said, do you know how we're going to treat you? You need to be very productive. You need to paint a lot. You need to get out there and be productive. And that's exactly what Vincent van Gogh was doing before. So in other words, before he got this treatment from this doctor, so this expert in mental illness, he was doing that anyway. In other words, the treatment he got for mental illness was the same as when he wasn't being treated for mental illness. So how do you explain that? The other aspect, and it's an irony that I think has escaped most art critics and most art historians, is Dr. Gachet was employed to treat Vincent van Gogh's mental illness. If Van Gogh committed suicide, then Dr. Gachet failed spectacularly in his diagnosis and his treatment. I mean, what is a more spectacular failure than your patient dying, and not only just dying, killing himself while he's in your care? And incredibly, Dr. Gachet, after Van Gogh's death, wanted payment for his services. It's almost like a surgeon saying, you know, I performed heart surgery on you. While I was performing it, my hand slipped and I speared your heart. Sorry, I killed you. But can you still pay me $500,000 for the surgery? I know I was supposed to do the surgery to save your life and to maybe perform a heart transplant, but I inadvertently killed you, but can you pay me for the surgery anyway? It's that ridiculous. And I think, as you can tell, I'm quite emotionally invested in this case, so much so that I went to France last year, and you know, I did my own sort of little pilgrimage, and I care about the fact that the world has been misled about this artist. I kind of get the feeling, you know, when I was at the graveyard and I looked at the grave, I kind of got the feeling Van Gogh is turning in his grave. Like, if he was quite an intense guy, if he knew what was going on, he would probably be fuming. Like, you would literally see smoke coming out of the grave. He's so upset with what's being told about him. And, you know, in the Watts case, there's been some talk about victim blaming, where you sort of blame the victim for what happened to them. When you say Vincent van Gogh's got mental illness, it's also kind of a bit like victim blaming. You know, he was responsible for his own troubles and his own death. You might like that idea. You might like the idea that he was so troubled he cut off his own ear. He was so troubled he committed suicide. He was so troubled he was mad. I don't think Van Gogh likes that idea. I think he wanted his art to speak for itself. As Simon Sharma said, he wanted people to feel the rush of life. But what people get more of a rush from is this idea of him being mad. In any event, let's deal with the letter from Albert Aurier. I'll certainly pin a comment just saying the actual analysis starts here. Sorry for those who've listened to that bit of ranting, but it's, you know, I think Van Gogh definitely does make one emotional. You know, you've had so many actors portraying him, and it is an emotional story. It's such a tragic story as well. You know, so much to offer the world, lost and shipwrecked. In any event, if you're interested in this series, please subscribe to the channel, like, share, leave a comment. Try and share to some art-related Facebook forums and that kind of thing. And let's get started. So Albert Aurier was a contemporary of Van Gogh. He was a bit younger than Van Gogh, born in May 1865. He died just 2 years after Van Gogh died. And I was watching a interview Willem Dafoe gave. Willem Dafoe played Van Gogh in At Eternity's Gate, and he was Oscar nominated for that performance. Obviously, the more emotional you play Van Gogh, the more you kind of get nominated. But it's not that Van Gogh wasn't emotional, but you've got to have the right kind of intensity, the right kind of interpretation. But what is interesting is Willem Dafoe said that Van Gogh in his time, the life expectancy was 41 years. So Vincent van Gogh fell 4 years short of the average life expectancy of that time. And so people weren't expected to live very long. People were expected to get ill and die. One thing people didn't expect was suicide. Suicide was very much kind of forbidden in Catholic France. I mean, we're going to get to that, but it was very much taboo. There was a big stink around it, and it caused a lot of upset, and it you know, you churches wouldn't allow a funeral if someone had committed suicide. You wouldn't be allowed to be buried with other people who committed suicide. That's the kind of environment it was. And of course, Vincent van Gogh was from a very pious family. I don't want to stray too far into that area because we're going to get to it, but I guess it is important. The point is, Albert Aurier died, quite young. I think he was about 20. He died at 27 years of age, so he was 10 years younger than Van Gogh when he died, and he died of tuberculosis. He was about 25 or so when he wrote the article about Van Gogh, the review, and that's kind of his claim to fame. Albert Aurier is sort of famous kind of because of that. He went to Paris to study law, but then he became drawn to art and literature, and then he began to contribute to symbolist periodicals. And it's something that you might disagree with me when I say how symbolic Van Gogh's art is. You might say, yeah, I think that's your interpretation. It's not my interpretation. It is well known. It is the kind of art that was being created at the time. It was symbolic, and it needed to be an extension, something in addition to what was being brought out by black and white photography, which was available at that time. So the fact that there's a black and white photo of Albert Aurier means, can a portrait do any better, like a painted portrait? And this is one of the reasons why Vincent van Gogh's self-portraits are so vivid. He's trying to add something, some fiery spark to his painting, his reimagining of his own visage compared to like a bland one-dimensional portrait, right? Photograph portrait. He's trying to breathe life and sentience into what he's painting. Does that make sense? So we're going to go through his review right now. It's dated January 1890, and let's go through it step by step. He writes, "Beneath skies that sometimes dazzle like faceted sapphires or turquoises, that sometimes are moulded of infernal, hot, noxious, and blinding sulphurs, beneath skies like streams of molten metals and crystals, which at times expose radiating torrid solar disks, beneath the incessant and formidable streaming of every conceivable effect." And so he goes on. It's quite a verbose start. I mean, it's very full of descriptors, isn't it? He talks about the incessant and formidable streaming of every conceivable effect of light in heavy, flaming, burning atmospheres that seem to be exhaled from fantastic furnaces where gold and diamonds and similar gems are volatilized. There is the disquieting and disturbing display of a strange nature that is at once entirely realistic and yet almost supernatural. Wow, it's still going on. Of an excessive nature where everything, beings and things, shadows and lights, forms and colors, rears and rises up with a raging will to howl its own essential song in the most intense and fiercely high-pitched timbre. And then he has a colon. So he starts off with a really long sentence. it's a really, really long sentence going on maybe a quarter of the page, and all good writers know you don't do that. You don't write. First of all, you don't write flowery prose, and this is extremely flowery. And you don't write long sentences. You try to build your case with several sentences that are like bricks laid over a foundation, and then building up to a kind of a structure. And so what this kind of demonstrates is Aurier's kind of a little bit of an amateur critic. I don't say what he's saying isn't true. I'm just saying that as a writer, he's still probably finding his feet somewhat. There is something to be said for what he's talking about. He's talking about the intensity of Van Gogh's paintings. The skies are very torrid, and they are very alive and electric with sunlight and energy. And that is something that is quite unique and powerful and quite beautiful about Van Gogh's work. That same fieriness in the sky also infects the air and the trees and the fields and even the mountains. So you kind of get a sense of restless turbulence from a lot of his art, but there's something vivid about it. There's something epic about it as well. And of course, all of this plays into the whole thing that if you're putting intensity into the art, aren't you saying, I'm mad? I'm mad, so I'm expressing my mad, intense view of the world onto the canvas. Well, yes, but are mad people able to be that eloquent to say, I'm mad, okay, but now I'm going to express my madness in a way that you're going to understand? Because mad people are usually incoherent. And there may be little pieces of coherency, like when someone is drunk, there are little pieces that are coherent, but overall it's kind of a mess. If you go on to the next page, he refers to trees twisted like giants in battle, proclaiming with the gestures of their gnarled, menacing arms and with a tragic waving of their green manes, their indomitable power, the pride of their musculature, their blood-hot sap, their eternal defiance of hurricane, lightning, and malevolent nature. It's very over the top. I mean, this review is very intense, just like Van Gogh. It's very expressive, just like Van Gogh. It's hectic. I mean, there's an excess of energy. You get that. Then he refers to another trademark aspect that Van Gogh captured, and I can tell you, when I was in Arles, I sort of kept my eyes peeled for cypresses, and you do see them. You especially see them when you approach Saint-Rémy, so they're definitely there. But when I sort of wandered around Arles, there were quite a few cypresses sort of popping up all over the place. And I kind of explain that by the fact that I think those cypresses came about during the Roman occupation. There is a Colosseum in the middle of Arles, and the cypress feels like a very Italian tree. It feels like a very it feels like a tree associated with old places and old buildings and graveyards, doesn't it? If you just look at the etymology of the word cypress, it comes from Old French, which is, I think, cyprès. Not quite sure how to pronounce it. Is it cyprès? Which was imported from Latin, cypressus, and that's the Latinization of the Greek kyparissos, or kyparissos, And so you can just see in the etymology of the word that the name of this tree kind of comes from that part of the world. It comes from the Greek Empire, and all those temples, that sort of very dusty area, and then onto Rome, and then from Rome on to France, which was once occupied by Rome and was once known as Gallia. But I'm just trying to take you kind of back in time to why these trees were so abundant around Arles, because I can tell you when I went to Auvers-sur-Oise, they're not there. They're not sort of in the northern part of France. So from an artistic point of view, there's quite a lot of history and even spirituality related to this tree. Cypresses are known for their longevity. Iran has got ancient cypresses, some dating 4,000 years old. It is a symbol often of mourning. You often found cypresses around, cemeteries. It often feels like a cemetery tree, both in the Muslim world and also throughout Europe. There's also a famous Roman cemetery in Arles that has cypresses around it. There is really a rich symbolic tradition of the cypress going back into antiquity, where it's related to cremations and the underworld, and there's even a well-known story by the poet Ovid, who wrote during the reign of Augustus, and I'm reading this from Wikipedia on talking about the cypresses, and it talks about what they refer to as the best known myth, showing the association between the cypress and grief. And there's a handsome boy called Cyparissus, who was a favorite of Apollo, and he accidentally killed a tame stag, so kind of a reindeer, and his grief was such that he was inconsolable, and he said, "I want to weep forever for what I've done." And so he was transformed into a cypress, and the tree sap was his tears. So that's kind of a personification of the association of the cypress and grief. And you can kind of imagine if Van Gogh was aware of this, he would have been drawn to the cypress as well, to kind of acknowledge his own sadness in certain areas. In his beautiful picture Starry Night, it looks like there's a very tall cypress sort of barreling out, almost like a tornado, to the side of the picture, up into the starry sky. That's a cypress. In the Jewish tradition, they use cypress wood to build Noah's Ark, as well as the famous temple. And so do you see, when you start weaving in the history and symbolism around something as simple as a tree, suddenly Van Gogh's art takes on a whole new meaning. It suddenly takes on this restless power of all the history that's behind it and in front of it. It really becomes like this vibrating mirage that's neither present in its time or in the future or in the past. It is just something that it's almost like a memory that you're seeing. That's how vivid it is. And of course, when Van Gogh was painting the cypresses, he was painting something that was idiosyncratic to that part of the world. You don't get cypresses, for example, in the Netherlands, where he was from. You don't get them in the middle of France or the north of France. You just don't get them there. You don't get them anywhere in Northern Europe. You get it in Southern Europe. Wikipedia describes these trees as dark green exclamation mark shaped trees, highly characteristic and kind of a signature of Mediterranean towns and villages. And something that's really interesting with the cypress is when even a slight wind blows, the tree moves a lot. It can kind of bend over quite a long way, even in a slight breeze. And so it kind of has a dramatic aspect to it. In other words, the way that it moves in the atmosphere is kind of more than other trees. And that's why, and this is again from Wikipedia, they talk about it as being known as the drama tree. Okay, and so coming back to Aurier, he doesn't really talk about any of this at all, but he does say the cypresses expose their nightmarish flame-like black silhouettes, mountains that arch their backs like mammoths or rhinoceri, white and pink and golden orchids, like the idealizing dreams of virgins, squatting passionately contorted houses in a like manner to beings who exult, who suffer, who think, stones, terrains, bushes, grassy fields, gardens, and rivers that seem sculpted out of unknown minerals, polished, glimmering, iridescent, enchanting, flaming landscapes, like the effervescence of multicolored enamels in some alchemist's diabolical crucible, foliage that seems of ancient bronze, of new copper, of spun glass. So, to my mind as a writer, pretty much everything is written thus far is kind of gibberish. It's sort of just used a lot of words to say the same thing, to say that Van Gogh's work is really vivid, that it's very powerful, that the colors evoke a great deal. And because of the verbosity of Aurier's description, it kind of loses all of its value. It sort of ends up being a clumsy mass of descriptors. It's a little bit like saying, if I say to you, I'm tired, and I say I'm very, 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 extremely, incredibly, very, 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 very tired. I've really just wasted your time with all that when you could just say I'm tired and it's just as effective. And I remember just in language things that I've studied where they say the word very often weakens something like that. You know, instead of saying I'm very tired, just say I'm tired. It's the same thing in terms of narrative. Because otherwise you can use very all the time. You can say that's very colorful, that's very nice, that, and then the word very just loses its value. The fact that you're mentioning it is emphasis enough. So we go on to, he talks about flower beds that appear less like flowers than opulent jewelry. He talks about the mad and blinding coruscation of things. Coruscation is a fancy adjective for flashing or sparkling or shining or brilliant or gleaming or glittering. But it can also mean severely critical, such as a coruscating attack on somebody. He talks about nature frenetically contorted, raised to the heights of exacerbation, becoming a nightmare, flame, lava, precious stone, light turning into conflagration, life into burning fever. I would almost dismiss that entire opening and just say, okay, so there's a lot of intensity in his art. It's very colorful, it's very yellow, it's very bright, right? You could basically summarize all of that in one or two sentences. I do think Aurier is on track. He sort of finds himself when he skips on to the next paragraph and he writes, such is the impression left on the retina when it first views the strange, intense, and feverish work of Vincent van Gogh, that compatriot and unworthy descendant of the old Dutch masters. I don't really know what he's saying about that. I don't know why he calls him the unworthy descendant. Unworthy how, unworthy why. In any event, he is right saying that there's something strange about it. There is something strange about his art, but strange in a compelling way. The same way that magic can be strange, but also interesting. It talks about the intensity and feverishness of the work. And again, all of this stuff plays into that idea of madness. You know, if you go back to the opening that I used to introduce these videos, Simon Sharma talks about Van Gogh wanting to share the rush of life through his paintings. What is the rush of life? Is the rush of life the rush of madness? Is being an intense person being a mad person? Is being a strange person being a mad person? Is working feverishly a sign of madness? And obviously the answer is, well, it could be, but it could equally be that something that's strange is strange without being mad. Something that's intense can be intense without being mad. Something that is feverish can be feverish without being mad. But if you want to sell Van Gogh for millions upon millions, then you don't want to say it's strange that is just strange. You want to say it's so strange it's mad. You don't want to say it's intense just in a normal expression of intensity. You want to say it's so intense it's mad. You don't want to say it's just feverish. You want to say it's so feverish it's the that frenetic capacity of madmen to, you know, get caught up in a passion. It's the absolute zenith of consciousness, but to the point of madness, where you are so conscious of everything that you're now going mad. And that's why, as I say, it's a very fine line to tread when we say, you know what explains all of this? Vincent van Gogh was mad. Because it's an easy explanation to sell. It's a much harder explanation to sell Vincent van Gogh, the ordinary guy who led quite a troubled life. You know, things didn't quite work out for him. And then we go on a bit further and he talks about the great traditional art, so healthy and very well balanced, of the Dutch past. And what he's talking about here is, as Vincent van Gogh left that behind, as he left behind traditional art, as he left behind healthy and well balanced art, you know, the modest Dutch landscapes, the subdued Dutch landscapes. Now you've got something that's the antithesis of that. It's fiery, it's bright, it's alive, it's vivid, it is colorful. I flew into Amsterdam from South Africa. So basically, I think I left here in early May and arrived in Amsterdam. And it was colder in Amsterdam than which was supposed to be early summer, than South Africa in early winter. It was colder, it was overcast, where it was bright and fairly warm in South Africa. And it was kind of grim. You know, quite soon after arriving in Amsterdam, I was ready to leave. I mean, I did actually have a flight to Portugal the same day that I arrived, and I was surprised that I didn't really want to be there. It was, you know, the buildings are beautiful, the canals are beautiful, but when it's cold and overcast, it's kind of gloomy. It was totally different when I arrived back towards the end of the month, and Amsterdam was sunny. It was barely warm. It certainly wasn't hot, but it was cool to warm. But the point is, I can understand Van Gogh wanting to get away from that dreariness, and that is the reason why I went to France. And I can understand, and that's also why I went to the south of France, to get more color into his world. And I've mentioned before, my great-grandfather, who's also from Holland, came to South Africa, and for a long time he couldn't get the dreariness out of his art. He would be painting South African landscapes, but with sort of milky blue, baby blue Dutch skies. And it took him a while to kind of realize this is the light that I'm seeing and the light that I'm painting isn't the same. They're different worlds. It's a different kind of light, and it took him a while to register that. And so Van Gogh, one of the reasons why you have a Dutch artist painting these vivid landscapes is because he wasn't in the Netherlands, because he was somewhere else, and also because he wanted to be somewhere else. So you could probably say the same thing about my great-grandfather as well, that he was painting these very vivid, towering scenarios, drenched in sunlight, because he wanted to be there. He wanted to not be in the sort of flat, dreary, cold, shadowy world, watery world. And so I don't know if it's accurate to sort of associate Dutch art, the mindset of it, with a kind of dreariness. I think you've got to associate Dutch art with the environment in which it's created. Doesn't that make a bit more sense? And of course, your environment is going to shape your consciousness in certain ways. It's going to make you aware of things that you weren't aware of. It's going to stretch your awareness. It's going to inspire you in the way dreary landscapes simply do not inspire you. They can, but only up to a dreary point, a point in the dreariness. So I don't really want to go into this aspect where Aurier sort of talks about the typical Dutch art, where he talks about handsome landscapes and restraint and balanced and timelessly enveloped in soft tones and greys and haze, as if that's better or kind of a more romantic era. I mean, in some ways I guess it is. But he is right to contrast them, to say how far from the delicate, always somewhat cloudy and somber colors of the northern countries. He's right to say, wow, this work is very viscerally different. It's inflamed with infernos of light and color. So bear in mind, when you in a dreary environment, all colors sort of become the same color. It becomes kind of brown, gray, and sort of darkish shadows. And when you in a vivid landscape, the color comes out, doesn't it? And so to his credit, Aurier says, make no mistake, Vincent van Gogh has by no means transcended his heritage. And he means this as a compliment. He's saying Van Gogh hasn't left behind the Dutch masters. He hasn't left behind this incredible heritage of Dutch art. He's taking that same heritage into this landscape, just as my great-grandfather did. He says he was subject to the effect of ineluctable atavistic laws, so laws that are rooted in the ancient past, that can't be changed. And he says he is good and duly Dutch, of the sublime lineage of Frans Hals. So he's saying, despite this discord, what you're seeing from Van Gogh is the epitome of that sort of reliable Dutch art, the good executions that we know from well-known Dutch artists. And some of the greatest artists in the world are Dutch. And so it's only at this point that Aurier starts to gravitate to the personage of Vincent van Gogh. So only at this point does he start taking on the human being that is walking around in France at the same time that Aurier is in Paris. He's starting to kind of shake his hand in the article, because he says, nevertheless, in the case of Vincent van Gogh, in my opinion, despite the sometimes misleading strangeness of his works, it is difficult for an unprejudiced and knowledgeable viewer to deny or question the naive truthfulness of his art, the ingenuousness of his vision. I'm just going to stop there and just go back through it. So what he's saying here is there is something misleadingly strange about his art. In other words, you look at it and you think it's strange, but you've been misled. It's not that strange. What you're seeing is kind of a naive truthfulness. He's basically just looking at the world and saying, look how vivid the world is. I mean, anywhere where you are in your world, you can look at the same thing and see the vibrations if you just open your mind to it. It's as simple as that. You don't need to be strange or mad. You just need to open your mind and imagine. And so what I can tell you about, I guess, the influence of Van Gogh on me fairly recently was in my garden, a Cape Robin raised a baby, and so I was sort of, and not in a nest, sort of outside the nest. It's a strange case where this bird is kind of a ground forager, and so when it has a chick, the chick isn't nest bound, it's sort of running around the garden and just hoping that cats don't sort of arrive. But anyway, I took quite an interest in this bird, and it's a beautiful little bird. And at one point I just saw this bird standing at the apex of a roof. It's sort of a brick gable, but kind of a biscuit brown. And this bird was standing at the top of kind of the pyramid of this brick gable, and behind it was this flourish of trees. And I suddenly saw kind of a Vincent van Gogh image there. I saw the electricity of in the trees. I saw the trees sort of broiling almost like cumulus clouds, even though they were just trees. I saw the brick going from like a one-dimensional surface to a very alive, red, burning substrate. And then I saw this bird almost like a messianic creature heralding the day, just saying what a beautiful day it was. And nothing totally profound about that. I'm just saying Van Gogh's way of seeing things had kind of infected me by seeing something beautifully profound in the ordinary, seeing the epic in the commonplace, seeing nature as absolutely pure and pristine, and kind of a home if we take care of it, a bright, beautiful, magical home if we take care of it. And so it's in this part of the article that Aurier refers to the ingenuousness of his vision, and it was, and it is. I mean, whatever you want to say about Van Gogh, you might say, I do think he was mentally ill, or I don't think he was mentally ill. Whatever your position on that, you can't deny that there was something ingenious and unique in his vision. Just seeing the sun, the radiance of the sun as something amazing. That the sun itself is amazing. And not to belittle it by putting like a smiley face on it, not to be that simplistic, but to emphasize the radiance that is around us. And how do you do that? And, some modern artists use what we call energy lines. Well, Van Gogh found them first. He found these energy lines. And that is the naive truthfulness that Aurier is talking about. It's naive, but not in a naive way, if that makes sense. It's naive in a in an emphatic way. It's almost when you love somebody and you realize you should be careful expressing your feelings, but you effusive about your feelings. In other words, there's something charming in that naivete. There's something necessary in that naivete. Do you know what I mean? So the naive truthfulness about it is what makes it so powerful. If it was less naive, it wouldn't be as truthful. If it was less naive, it wouldn't be as powerful, if that makes sense. Naive is almost another way of saying simple, but also effective. And then he talks about the independent, indefinable aroma of good faith and of the truly seen that all his paintings exude. So what he's saying is Van Gogh's seeing something in the landscape that is truly, it's almost like holy. He's seeing a landscape that edifies. It edifies itself, but it also edifies man. It says we're living in a magical world. We're surrounded by magic. Our existence itself is magical, and there's solace in that. Despite the fleetingness of life, there's something powerful about just being alive. And in that rush of life, there's a kind of a transcendence of all the atrophies and entropies, and the worms gnawing at the living organism. This rush of life transcends that, and it's almost by the more vivid the color that he was using, the more there was this sense of transcending death, or hardship, or illness, or one's troubles. And then he refers to the constant harmony between the most excessive color notes. And there again, I want to emphasize this whole idea of, if Van Gogh was mentally unstable, seriously mentally ill, mad, you wouldn't have a harmony, and you certainly wouldn't have a constant harmony with his color tones, because that's something you need to concentrate to achieve. It doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen by fluke. It doesn't happen by sort of being unconsciously mad. You've got to be consciously sane in order to develop that synchronicity. He talks about the conscientious study of character, the continual search for the essential sign of each thing. 1,000 significant details undeniably assert his profound and childlike sincerity. Nothing in this review talks about his work being chaotic or kind of excessively restless or moody or unstable, or anything that would be giving away a hint that this guy's nuts. He's saying instead there's something incredibly clever about this art. There's something incredibly cohesive and integrated about this art. There's sincerity, there is harmony, there is vision, there is truth in it. And he talks about 1,000 significant details undeniably assert his profound and almost childlike sincerity, his great love for nature and for truth, his own personal truth. Now, if you were Van Gogh and you were mad and you were a symbolist, wouldn't you want to express your madness? Wouldn't you want to show clouds that are sort of angry? And when you want to show a landscape that is twisted and sort of violent in a storm, wouldn't you want to express that disquiet in those sort of ways? Instead of showing how beautiful and rich and balanced a landscape is, if you are not that, wouldn't you want to depict that through cracks in rocks and bleeding sunsets and just very severe interpretations of what you see in nature. Cracks and canyons in the earth, trees that have been, fallen by a storm or incinerated by lightning. Wouldn't you want to paint characters that are in anguish? Wouldn't you want to paint beggars and diseased prostitutes to show your own misery and malaise, your sickness? Oh, so we're at 54 minutes. I'm going to go speed up a little bit now. It talks about, we are thus able to infer legitimately from Van Gogh's works themselves his temperament as a man, or rather as an artist, an inference that I could, if I wished, corroborate with biographical facts. Now this is fantastic. This is where Aurier is really getting down to business, and he's saying, let's talk about the temperament of this guy, the mood of this guy, the mind of this guy. Who are we talking about? And he says, I'm not just going to talk about this giving my opinion. Let's talk about it by looking at facts. Let's talk about the artist's biography. And he talks about what characterizes Van Gogh's work as a whole is its excess of strength, of nervousness, its violence of expression. Now, again, I can see the proponents of the madness thing cheering, saying, yes, can you see? There's excess of nervousness. He is mad, the violence of expression. But there's also just people who have a temperament that is, I wouldn't use the word excess, but I would say extrovert. I would say that you can have a lot of intensity as a person. You can also have a lot of anxiety as a person. I think I'm a little bit like that. It's not anxiety necessarily in the typical sense. In other words, it's not that you're walking around seeing ghosts around every corner. It is just that you're very hypervigilant. It's that kind of anxiety, and anxiety is probably the wrong word. But here he's talking about the excess as a strength. He talks about the strength of nervousness, the strength of being plugged into the world, and so you feel all of this energy. And you can think of nervousness as weak, or as not a good situation, but you can also think of nervousness as being primed and ready and responsive to what is around you, right? So you can, I have a lot of birds in my garden. You often see some of them that they're just always nervous. The sparrows especially are always nervous. Does that mean there's something wrong with them? No, that is good for them. It's good for them to be aware of their surroundings. So that's another way of describing this nervousness, is an awareness of what's going on around you. There's some birds that sort of land on a potato bush right beside my window, and you make the smallest movement and they'll fly away. And then the other birds, you can stand right up against the window. I can sometimes take out my camera. You can sometimes move quite deliberately and in a way that you think would upset them. And the mouse birds just chomp on the leaves happily, like they're kind of like saying, I know you're behind the glass, you're no threat to me, you never have been, I'm comfortable. And so you would say they have less nervousness. So think of nervousness in those terms, not necessarily in the terms we think of it generally today, as being almost neurotic. Aurier goes on to say, in his categorical affirmation of character of things, in his often daring simplification of forms, in his insolence in confronting the sun head-on, he says, a powerful figure is revealed, masculine, daring, very often brutal, yet sometimes ingeniously delicate. And this is basically his description of Van Gogh. He's saying, if you look at all of these interpretations of what he's seeing, the figure that emerges is powerful. This is a powerful presence that we have in the world. in terms of this artist. This is a powerful mind. This is a powerful interpretation. And what is the nature of this interpretation? It's strong. It's masculine. It's daring. He's almost saying it's brave. He also uses the word brutal. And I guess some of those landscapes do feel like infernos. Some of his self-portraits do give that sense of harshness. I mean, think about the self-portrait where he's cut off his ear. Maybe that's what Aurier is referring to. And then he says, yet sometimes ingeniously delicate. And in the dramatization of Lust for Life, when it depicts Starry Night, the music suggests madness. It sort of shows quickly zooming in on those twirling star shapes. And then the music kind of conveys the sense of madness, the sort of clanging music while the camera is jumping around. In particular, that picture. Now, I don't know about you, but when I look at Starry Night, I don't see madness. I see brilliance. I see genius. I see the poetry of the universe. I see a beautiful fairy tale in terms of how the cosmos, the carpet of the cosmos, sweeps over, sort of bicycles over a tiny little town. And you kind of get the sense both of reality and the fairy tale kind of coming together. And that is, I think, this ingenious, delicate touch that Van Gogh kind of had, which is where something can be expressed almost furiously, almost excessively, but at the same time there's something very delicate about it. And that's also why I think he loves the sunflower. The sunflower is a strong plant. I mean, it's a big-headed flower, and yet, despite that strength, despite the vividness of that yellow, there's also something delicate about a sunflower. It is, you know, the way that it's tilting towards the sun, the way that it is, the color is both effusive and yet it's got a sort of a purity, a delicate purity about it. Aurier goes on to say, this respect and his love for the reality of things does not suffice alone to explain or to characterize the profound, complex and quite distinctive art of Vincent van Gogh. No doubt, like all the painters of his race, he is very conscious of material reality, of its importance and its beauty. But even more often, he considers this enchantress only as a sort of marvelous language destined to translate the idea. He is almost always a symbolist. You should think about what he says there in the context of, well, Van Gogh's mad. So I guess everything that is rendering is just sort of automatic. It's just luck. It's the madness speaking. It's not conscious. It's not consciously symbolic. It's just mad luck, I guess. He goes on to say, as for the brilliant and radiant symphonies of color and line, whatever may be their importance for the painter in his work, they are simply expressive means, simply methods of symbolization. So it's just really important to be aware that symbolism is so important in Van Gogh's work. And we're going to take this idea into especially June and July and say, is there symbolism in Van Gogh's art that is indicating his intention to commit suicide? Can we see a shift in his moods one way or the other? What is his art telling us? And then also, what does he say he wants his art to say, in his letters. So we don't only have his art, but the fact that we have 75 paintings in the last 80 days of his life is already an incredible archive to draw from. And then besides that, we've got almost daily correspondence from him talking about those pictures. And so we're going to get, I think you can agree with me, we're going to get a very, very clear idea of where this guy's head is, aren't we? Interestingly, Aurier refers to the idea of being crazy or mad or insane in his review when he uses the word imbecile, right? I'm going to just read you the quote where this word appears. He says, talking about skies rubescent at sunset, sometimes amid the golden dust of blazing noons, how could we explain the sower without considering that idée fixée, I'm not quite sure what that means, that haunts his brain about the necessary advent of a man, a messiah, sower of truth, who would regenerate the decrepitude of our art and perhaps our imbecile and industrialist society. And this is what I find so effing ironic, is we live in a world that has gone mad. If you just look at social media, it is a cacophony of meaninglessness most of the time. A broad swathe of social media is a meaningless chatter, right? If you look at how companies operate and how our world operates and how politicians operate and the whole thing mixed together, one can really say that we live in a mad world full of people who think that they're sane but nevertheless do the same thing every single day and I guess want a different outcome. We live in a crazy society, and then this crazy society looks to Van Gogh, and I think that's part of the problem is they say, well, look, he was good for something, wasn't he? He was crazy, but it was worth something. And that seems to be kind of a projection saying, oh, isn't my madness worth something? Isn't my mad life worth something? Aren't I redeemed? Aren't I ultimately going to be redeemed? But that's not what is going on here. What Aurier is talking about is how Van Gogh exposes the decrepitude of our art and our ridiculous society through his truth, through the truth in his art and through the naive, I don't want to use the word truth again, but the naive veracity that he's expressing in his art. So he's kind of saying that Van Gogh's art is providing kind of succor, kind of a soothing place to escape the insanity of the world, is in nature. And maybe even in art. And I mean, that is what Van Gogh himself was trying to do. He was trying to escape exactly that by going out into the world and painting it. So nowhere in this article does Aurier ever hint that Van Gogh is mad or unstable or anything like that. What he basically says is the work has an intensity about it, and he doesn't go further than that. And this was a review written right at the end of Van Gogh's life. And so to conclude, we get to the very end of the article, and it says, how could we explain that obsessive passion for the solar disk that he loves to make shine forth from his emblazoned skies, and at the same time for that other sun, that vegetable star, the sumptuous sunflower, which he repeats tirelessly, monomaniacally, if we refuse to accept his persistent preoccupation with some vague and glorious heliomythic allegory. And I think that's a terrible ending from Aurier. I think overall, I would score this review 4 or 5 out of 10 for how well written it is. I don't think it's very well written at all. I know what he's getting at. I know what he's driving at. I just don't think he's expressing it very well. He gets 10 out of 10 for being descriptive. He gets 10 out of 10 for almost duplicating Van Gogh's intensity through a very intense review. I just don't think it's very well written at all. But there are little nuggets in there that are fairly well expressed, and this is, I guess, one of them. He talks about what he's driving at the end here is he's talking about, and he seems to like using very big words. He likes using a bigger word rather than a simpler word. So when he talks about heliomythic allegory, he's really just talking about Van Gogh using the sun as a symbol. He's just talking about how the sun is used as a symbol of salvation and warmth and I guess regeneration and healing and illumination and divine life. And in this last sentence, which is so overstated, is basically just saying, how could we explain Van Gogh's interest in the sun and the sunflower if, other than to say he's trying to communicate the symbolic aspects of the sun and the sunflower. He's trying to talk about God in the world, God in nature, the radiance, the light of the Spirit, the light of God manifest in the light of the world, right? And I think a modern way to juxtapose this is to talk about the Matrix, where you see Neo seeing the world in computer code. He's seeing it not as flat surfaces and not as opaque objects, but he's seeing through all of this, he's seeing the fluid energy, the radiance, the pulsating radiance of the world through that kind of digitized metaphor. So in the same way that Neo in the Matrix was kind of a savior figure for seeing the world in a way that no one else could and feeling his way through this world that no one else could, Van Gogh was doing the same through his art. It's the same way of seeing the light of the world, seeing through things and seeing things as energy, I guess. This is a very long episode. I apologize for that. I think some of you probably would prefer much shorter. Please let me know if that's the case. Especially when it comes to Van Gogh, I'd rather just be as effusive as I can be. But if a lot of you are unhappy with the length of these episodes, let me know and I'll do my best to cut them down. Let me know what's the ideal length as well, and I'll try and keep it to that sort of thing. Another way is just for you, the audience, to listen to as long as you can at a time, or I can just cut episodes into half-hour packages or whatever it is. But otherwise, the next episode I'm going to be dealing with Vincent van Gogh's letter to his mother, talking about this review, and I think that's going to be both shorter and more interesting than this particular episode, so look out for that. On the Patreon channel, I'll be dealing with the latest podcast on John Bonet, dealing with the Hendersons. And tomorrow, also on Patreon, I'll be dealing with something an analysis I did on the best mainstream theory on the John Bonet Ramsey case and why that's still full of crap. So as much as we can ridicule this podcast that's coming out, even the best mainstream theory isn't true either. And that kind of leaves us in a pickle. If the version, the intruder version isn't right, and if the alternative is the Ramsays did it, but that's not right either, then what is right? I'm talking about the version that CBS provided and all those experts. If that version's full of crap, then what is the actual correct version? Thank you for listening, and the next episode in the Van Gogh series will probably be on the 19th, which is 130 years ago on that day that Van Gogh wrote to his mother. And I'll see you guys next time.